With that, I'd like to introduce Ed Vasco, who is the CEO of Terra Verde, and Ed's going to talk about implementing vulnerability management programs today. Ed?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody today, and I know we're going to have a really good discussion here about vulnerability management programs. Some quick agenda items, just to kind of set the stage. We're going to take a little bit of time, and I'm going to spend some time talking about kind of first-generation vulnerability management programs and some of the challenges that they faced, and then we'll get into some very specific methods, 3 high-level topics with lots of detail, and that's really going to be the bulk of the webinar today, about methods to implementing a successful vulnerability management program. As you move through that process, what we want to share with you are things that you should expect from your organization, and these are common issues and concerns, and so we want to present some ideas around solving those based upon the work that we've done with clients around the world. Finally, we're going to get into some sample reporting and then some questions and answers. So really looking forward to a great interactive webinar here with questions at the end. So to kind of set the stage, some information about myself. Again, I'm the CEO of Terra Verde. We are a really strong channel partner with cStor. They are a terrific partner of ours in the marketplace. And from an experience standpoint, I've been in the cybersecurity industry for about 25 years now in a dedicated sense. And so as you might gather, I'm old. I've been there and done that in many, many ways. My company, Terra Verde, we've been in business since 2008, so we're just going on about 9 years here, and we've been very specifically focused on cybersecurity and helping organizations with whatever cybersecurity needs they happen to have, and with really strong partners like cStor out in the marketplace working with us and working with you, we can help solve any kind of security problems that you may happen to have. Really, I want to get into the kind of the meat of the presentation here. And when cStor originally approached us about working and doing up this webinar, and they talked about a security checkup, the first thing that came to my mind really was this picture. This is kind of the title of this picture originally was the Village Doctor Besieged. And I think this really exemplifies visually what I would call first-generation vulnerability management programs. In this particular case, what we have here is in the upper right-hand quadrant of the picture. Rather than a doctor, I would emphasize that this would be a security professional looking to implement a vulnerability management program within the organization. And what typically happens, and what we have seen happen in organizations, is that a very limited team of people try to utilize a series of tools and a series of processes that result in the organization and the company clamoring for different kinds of results and setting expectations and creating cues within the organization whereby the security professional ends up having to sequester themselves, trying to decide who do I serve first, where do I apply my resources, and ultimately the end program ends up becoming very adversarial and antagonistic. And in fact, you end up with, if the villagers here are representative not just of the different IT groups that are impacted by a vulnerability management program, such as the network team, the services, the systems team, they're also representative of the business processes that are impacted. So, the visualization here would be that the baby in this picture would be some sort of new service trying to be pushed forward to the front of the queue, and the doctor or the security professional in this case not being able to cover the entire crowd. And ultimately what this leads to, this kind of first generation program, is what we've seen is more often than not it leads to firebrands and pitchforks from the IT and business community, being brought forward to the information security and cybersecurity program within companies, demanding change, that the program doesn't work, and it ultimately leads to a breakdown of the program and it becomes non-effective. So seeing that and having seen organizations go through that, we've discovered that there's a better approach and there's a better series of methods for success that can be brought forward, and we want to talk about those today very specifically. What we're specifically going to be talking through are a series of 3 high-level topics, and with specific details underneath each one. And really what the first item comes down to, if you're looking to implement something and mature your vulnerability management program, the first key question you have to ask yourself is, what critical data does your company or organization deal with on a day-to-day basis? Is it personally identifiable information? Is it private health information? Is it credit card, PAN data? Is it intellectual property? Is it something else that your organization specifically has been entrusted with or utilizes on a day-to-day basis that's considered critical and needs protecting? Because that's really at the core of not just a vulnerability management program, but of a cybersecurity program, is understanding what the critical data is within your organization. Further, realizing and understanding the compliance implications and requirements that may come into play. And this is very impactful to programs in that, as an example, let's take the payment card industry, PCI, credit card protections. The specific framework that merchants that process, transmit, or store credit card information that they have to go through are very prescriptive in the PCI framework as it relates to implementing a vulnerability management program, and the types of controls and the types of frequency of scanning, the type of policy sets that need to be in place are very, very prescriptive, whereas other requirements may not necessarily be as prescriptive. So understanding not just where your data is, but what sort of compliance structures and compliance impacts are impacting that data are going to be extremely important. So first, do you know where your critical data is residing, where it exists and where it's located? Then the second key question is really understanding the assets in your network. Do you know what those assets are? Do you know what assets are supporting that critical data? All too often, first-generation vulnerability management programs attempt to use the cliche. They try to eat the elephant in one big bite, and all too often there's not enough information and awareness of what sort of assets are within your environment that support the critical data that you're entrusted with. And so, as you understand where those assets are, part of the key issue and key first requirement of a program is really taking the time to do simple and slow discovery scans, finding out where your assets reside. Because all too often, when we ask the question of cybersecurity leaders, do you know, is your program effective? Is your vulnerability management program effective? They immediately come back and say, we don't even know what our assets look like. We don't even know where they're located. And I know that that's a very typical problem. And so our approach and suggestion is take the time to do the necessary asset scans and utilize the tool sets that you may be implementing to conduct those asset scans so that you very clearly understand what's across your network and what systems, databases, networks, applications are supporting that critical data. The next question is, do you know your scope? Do you know the scope of the vulnerability management program? All too often, organizations cybersecurity programs try to size their scope too large initially. They take an approach of saying, well, we need to understand where all vulnerabilities are across the entire environment. And while that is a very achievable long-term strategic goal, trying to do that in the first day or even in the first month is a very challenging task, which ultimately and all too often leads back to those firebrands and pitchforks that I presented before. So the tool sets that are out there today, and just as an aside, the intent of this presentation is not to really focus on specific tool vendors. There are many out there in the marketplace, and so we highly recommend you examine all the tools, but really understand that there are different tools for different types of scanning, different tools for different platforms. The scope that you initially take on within your program is going to help dictate the success of it. And this actually is a maturity scale that we present and recommend our clients go through, and that if you're looking to do vulnerability management initially within systems and networks, servers and networks, that tends to be relatively easy. The approach to doing so can be done in a good, solid fashion. Databases tend to present a bit of medium level of difficulty. Endpoints, laptops, desktops, mobile devices, applications as well, those tend to be very, very hard and difficult to achieve because of the depth and breadth, as we'll see as we get into this discussion, that they tend to be a little bit harder. And then finally, in terms of maturity, the mobile side and cloud in particular, understanding the vulnerabilities within your mobile environment, if they're in-house developed applications or if they're applications that are used within an MDM solution, they tend to be a little bit harder to validate and harder to examine, simply because they all too often require some level of code review or some level of external connection point or external validation of a service provider or an application provider. So they tend to be very hard to incorporate into a successful vulnerability management program. The next couple of key questions here, really again, just kind of to round out do you know these items? Do you know where these items are and what your environment looks like? Is really understanding the scanning policy. All too often organizations, again, they throw the kitchen sink at the environment. In fact, to share a very quick story, Terra was brought in to an organization that had actually locked out its Active Directory environment and locked out all of its administrator accounts, simply because the initial vulnerability management program that had been put in place was throwing a very, very rough policy where password reviews and authentication reviews were being thrown against the Active Directory domain, and the administrator account was locked, as well as all other administrator accounts. So they called us in to help with that and help essentially right the organization accordingly. So ultimately, knowing what your scanning policy is, and realizing that the need to throw the kitchen sink at your organization is unnecessary. Instead, we definitely want you to consider doing slow but steady kinds of scanning. Further, the question that always comes forward is, do I do authenticated scans or do unauthenticated scans? In other words, do I do scanning that is administrator driven? And as you'll see with all tools that are out there, if you do authenticated oriented scanning, you're going to discover a significantly higher number of vulnerabilities. We typically recommend you start with unauthenticated scans. The reason being is that it will help the rest of your organization begin to consume the data that you're going to be generating out of your scanning tools, and then move slowly to an authenticated scan approach. Because again, the number of vulnerabilities that you're going to discover as root on a Linux system or as administrator with administrative privileges on a Windows system is going to be significantly higher, and it's also going to drive into other endpoint or other system-related vulnerabilities, such as Adobe or Flash or many others of that nature. Understanding your scanning frequency as well. Do you scan once a month? Do you scan certain assets once a quarter? Again, that will come down to the type of data and as well as the compliance frameworks that your organization and company have to abide by. Finally, the overall remediation frequency. How often are you anticipating the rest of the organization taking the outputs of your vulnerability management program, scan results, and implementing patching or implementing remediation, how often will they have to go through that process? Because they'll impact workloads, it'll impact the overall effectiveness of the rest of the IT group. Ultimately, understanding where your departmental champions and leaders and gatekeepers also reside will help immensely help the success of your vulnerability management program. Understanding change management windows, if you have any. If you don't have change management and there's a significant lack of other governance-related items, that's a different topic. But assuming that you do have some type of change management window and change management structure in your organization, understanding how vulnerability scanning can fit into that change window and be impacted by the change window that your company or organization has is extremely important to understand. So the second major topic really comes down to that old adage of slow and steady wins the race. With the exception, of course, being that if you have a breach or you have a compliance requirement that is demanding immediate attention, then we typically recommend a very strong top-down approach. Get executive management buy-in, get executive leadership to help drive the need for a vulnerability management program to be put in place or to be enhanced so they can become more effective. Assuming that you don't have that kind of pressing need, then taking a very pragmatic approach is kind of job one of a successful vulnerability management program, because ultimately you're going to be working with very specific teams who are probably just as understaffed and overwhelmed as you are from a cybersecurity perspective, and they're going to need continual education. They're going to need to continually see the reasons why this is important from a positive perspective, because while vulnerabilities are constantly being put into the marketplace and being discovered, and the need for a programmatic approach is extremely important, having the rest of the IT group understand that is a key step in the successful implementation of a program. Further, not just being pragmatic, but being patient, realizing that all too often we see cybersecurity programs try to push organizations too hard to try to remediate and try to patch and try to fix. The realization is that the rest of IT has limited resources. They have limited amounts of cycles by which they can go through and actually remediate items. So the scanning that you do initially will likely show the same kinds of vulnerabilities time and time again. The patience that's required is twofold. It's patience on the cybersecurity program side, the people executing the vulnerability management program. The patience is also going to be required, and education will be required around that patience to the rest of IT and to the rest of the business as those changes are made throughout the organization. Deploying the deployment process. This is an area where we typically recommend trying to tackle in parallel a number of different areas of IT. If you go back to the maturity model that I laid out before, endpoints can be kind of hard to achieve some level of maturity and some level of forward movement around around patching and the identification of vulnerabilities. As an example, clients that we've seen and worked with, when they do authenticated-oriented endpoint scanning, they typically end up with millions of vulnerabilities. Now, the interesting thing there, of course, is that when you really analyze the data, those millions of vulnerabilities that they end up with are typically a result of two to three different patches or issues that are discovered that impact all of their endpoints. So there's an exponential growth to the number of vulnerabilities that are identified. And so we recommend that you typically try to address as early as possible the endpoints within your environment, because that, for the rest of the IT team and the rest of your IT organization, that typically is the largest level of work effort that's involved. So you want to get them on board, you want to get those scans done and get an understanding and awareness going through the organization of the impacts to the endpoints themselves. Using the right tools for the right assets is extremely important as well. Typically what we find is organizations, they'll purchase a vulnerability scanning tool. They will then take that tool, and its focus is on systems and networks, and they don't necessarily have the greatest experience or the greatest results scanning applications or databases. So using the right tool in the right location in the right way is extremely important, and it will help enhance the level of data that you're able to give to IT for remediation purposes. One area that we see that's very, very successful in getting the implementation and successful integration of vulnerability management into the rest of IT is by helping IT understand the need to do remediation, to do patching, and aligning performance metrics into the performance metrics of the rest of IT into the successful implementation of that program. So we'll get into some of those items here a little bit later in terms of some of our sample reports. But the integration of those performance metrics and helping IT actually be bonused, so to speak, on the successful implementation of remediation that comes as a result of the scanning that's been done is extremely important to the successful implementation. As you go through these processes, you have to think programmatically. All too often we see vulnerability management tools being used once or twice a year, and the need really is to implement a program that's effective so that you establish a strong cadence. You know, again, what's your scanning policy? How often are you scanning? Are you scanning on a 30-day basis or on a 90-day basis? What systems and assets are you scanning? How often are you expecting the rest of the organization to respond and to remediate what's been presented? Building the documentation, building the best practices for your organization depends also upon the maturity of your organization and the rest of your IT team. How large are they? How many people? How many cycles can they present? What sort of tools do they have for remediation efforts? Ultimately, what you're looking to try to do is implement the vulnerability management program into a larger cyber hygiene and cybersecurity program that is critical to helping your organization reduce risk levels appropriately. So as we move through this, as we look at things that you should expect, I mean, these are some of the common issues that we see organizations present as you move your vulnerability management program forward. In particular, in the time remaining, I want to focus on two quick items. The third and fourth bullet, these scans don't represent our environment. All too often we see first generation new vulnerability management programs trying to go out and scan everything and present details. This comes back to my suggestion around scanning for assets very slowly. You're going to need to do iterative scanning for assets and scanning for vulnerabilities initially so you can set a baseline. All too often we see systems come online during end of quarter for financial reporting, or systems come online during peak season in the retail community, and this increase of capacity skews vulnerability management scans one way or the other, either telling IT that there are too few assets or telling IT that there may be too many assets. And this comes down to the policy that's being used, as well as the overall number of assets within the environment. And then the final item is we took care of that. Mark it as a false positive. And this is something that we hear very often as tools are being implemented and being used, that IT comes back and says, well, we put that patch in place. Our strong recommendation is that cybersecurity programs don't just rely upon the tool. They fall back to the common practice within our profession, which is trust but verify. So the tool will tell you so much, but we certainly recommend, as an aside, to manually review those systems where possible to ensure that patches are in place, because Otherwise, IT can get into a mode where that becomes a common phrase and a common parlance, and it actually reduces the effectiveness of your program. Ultimately, what you're trying to achieve and get to is where IT and the business is asking you, where are the metrics, where are the numbers, how are we looking, how are we doing? And one key thing that we highly recommend is trying to turn, once you receive that kind of feedback, turn the vulnerability management program into a game. The gamification of vulnerability management programs is a new area, and it's extremely successful. Where you have separate teams in particular, let's say you have a Linux team and a Windows team and a network team, we see that there's high effectiveness of showing the same kinds of data points, so number of vulnerabilities, age of vulnerabilities, number of reduced vulnerabilities week over week or month over month, whatever your scanning policy calls for, helps to drive competitive views across these various teams. And further driving that are the types of prizes that, so giving prizes to those teams, either, kudos or pizza parties or, even monetary rewards. And as I mentioned before, tying the effectiveness of the overall vulnerability management program to performance metrics, bonuses, or year-end reviews is extremely important to the successful implementation of a program. And then reporting that progress over time, not just giving a singular snapshot that is only for a particular month, but instead, as an example, this is a sample report for a very successful vulnerability management program that's been implemented that shows here on the right-hand side the type of systems based upon specific asset groups. So here are Windows servers, non-PCI, Linux servers, non-PCI, Linux servers that are in the PCI environment, and Windows servers that are in the PCI environment. That show over a period of time, these various weeks, it gives a sense of understanding and awareness to each of these individual teams, how they're doing. And in certain instances, we see these spikes that come on up as it relates to specific kinds of vulnerabilities that are released into the wild and discovered in the environment. And it also begins to show how quickly they can be remediated. So here's a team, in this particular case, the Linux non-PCI environment. They're very on the ball in terms of identifying and patching, whereas the non-PCI Windows team tends to have a little bit more difficulty being able to patch over time. What this leads to is the concept of a money line, essentially giving, again, the embeddedness of performance metrics to help enhance the vulnerability management program. You can identify and very quickly align to if you can get your vulnerabilities down below this line, you're going to be in the money, so to speak, in terms of your performance metrics. Again, it helps drive the competitive nature and competitive aspects of your IT team. This is another series of reports that we recommend and various kinds of reporting metrics. Again, open different kinds, different levels of vulnerabilities, the average number of vulnerabilities per host, and then based upon the scanning scope, if they're in the PCI zone or the non-PCI zone accordingly. So I know we've come up on our time here and gone a little bit over. Really do appreciate the opportunity to talk, and think I'm going to turn it back over to the team at cStor for follow-up questions, and looking forward to any sort of questions you may happen to have.
Thank you so much, Ed. At this time, we will open it up for Q&A. As a reminder, you can post questions to the questions pane inside the GoToWebinar control panel. We do have a few coming in. I know we're running a little bit long, Ed, but we'll squeeze them in. I think it's good to get a few in. First question, how do you recommend creating internal champions and supporters to help remove roadblocks? That's probably a great question that a lot that people are struggling with. Do you have some advice there?
That's great. Yeah, I sure do, and that's a really great question. Our typical approach really is going to be dependent upon the type of organization your company or organization is. In that, if there's a top-down culture Certainly getting your CIO or getting your executive team to buy into and support the scanning and the reports and the metrics is extremely important. Further, I'm a big believer in the idea that most people want to do the right thing. When push comes to shove, most people want to do the right thing, and they just need to be made aware and educated around what the best approaches happen to be. So our recommendation when we're trying to find champions within specific areas of IT are look for those leaders within the respective groups. So is there a senior network admin, as an example, who has some time under their belt within your company or within your organization, as well as some experience within the marketplace, and has a perspective that they want to do the right thing, that they understand that there are vulnerabilities that are out there, and they want to help make their IT environment run more effectively. Ultimately, you're going to have people that are naysayers that are going to challenge, but I think if you can find those senior people or find those people who want to take the right approach and who want to learn and who recognize that there are issues out there in the market, and that there are vulnerabilities out there and they're constantly changing, those are the people that you want to align to.
Awesome, thank you. Another great question. Any ideas on how to gamify? Any examples or tips you can give on that?
Yeah, no. So, unfortunately, I really wanted to try to get into that in a lot more detail. The time frame of the webinar, that's a whole separate conversation, really. But I think, one of the key things there would be to utilize the reports that you have available. So by creating those champions initially, by reaching out and communicating to those champions, then taking the time to invite them to an initial meeting where you're going to lay out for them, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to achieve this, and using some initial scan results. Maybe over the first 60 days you do multiple scans. Your environment may differ, but the typical approach would be take a couple of baseline scans, set some perspective to that team of champions, and then have them help drive the message that there's a competition going on here between the Windows team and the network team, with a prize at the end. I mean, I think that's really the key issue here, is that ultimately the gamification has to have some level of resultant prize. I'm a big believer in carrots, not sticks, when it comes to the successful implementation of a program like this, whereby you're saying to the team that can reduce the number of vulnerabilities by a certain percentage. We can get into very specific details around numbers of vulnerabilities versus percentages, but we typically look at things and say, to even it out, go by the percentage of reduction of vulnerabilities, and really help those teams understand by following through. So you set up the necessary teams, you create the necessary champions, and have them drive and help drive that message, and then whatever you've aligned as a prize, follow through with it, and then set that up as a recurring cadence. Not just through the process of one time. I mean, the whole idea here is that you're implementing a program, not a one-time event. And I think through those kinds of efforts, you're going to be able to create the necessary competition that have people looking proactively at how systems and networks, or how IT itself is being implemented to support the business, in such a fashion that the end state and end goal should be that over time you're able to reduce those vulnerabilities significantly through proactive management. As each project is implemented, the IT team should be looking and saying, how do we reduce the number of vulnerabilities? Because that makes their job that much more effective over time.
Excellent, thank you. I think we'll squeeze one more in. I get being patient, but what tangible results can we expect early on in the process of launching a more consistent program? I think it's a great question.
Can you repeat the first part of that?
Yes, I get being patient, but what tangible results can we expect early on in the process of launching a more consistent program? Does that make sense?
So yeah, it sure does. It sure does. Thank you. That's a great question. I would say that the tangible results really come down to a couple of key things. One, once you understand the assets, once you've gone through and baselined what those assets look like, and what vulnerabilities exist upon those assets, it gives you an opportunity to start to set some baseline reduction goals. Our typical suggestion and approach is that within the first 6 months, you should see a reduction goal of about 25%, realizing that there's going to be a continued state, a continual, for lack of a better term, white noise state, that you'll always have vulnerabilities in the environment. But a reduction of about 25% really results in what I would classify as the criticals and the highs. Those typically are go through vulnerabilities that have those identifications that are critical or high, have exploits that are known, they're in the wild, and they're pervasive, or they're extremely impactful to organizations. Those are the typical categories, and that's really where you should focus the IT team, and that's where the education piece comes in and is so critical, is that helping IT understand our goal here is to reduce risk, and in doing so, we're looking to really achieve a reduction of about 25% off these critical and high elements that are being presented. From there, it's a slow, patient approach to get the organization over time to get medium vulnerabilities taken care of, and as well, once you get beyond medium vulnerabilities, and assuming you're able to achieve that over a long period of time, the actual level of work effort to achieve anything beyond that becomes more and more difficult. It should become more and more proactive. The emphasis would be back to IT to say, let's take care of these vulnerabilities before we put systems in place. So what sort of gold images can we update? How do we ensure more effective governance of projects? Those kinds of approaches that are more proactive in their structure. But out of the box, out of the gate, I would say that you would typically look to, within the first 6 months, probably a reduction of about 25% of your baseline vulnerabilities.
Excellent. Thank you so much.